Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be our 6th video. And obviously, if those of you watching are of the same mindset as I am, and more than likely you are a little shocked and more than a little disheartened by the outcome of the last election cycle, which just ended the day before yesterday. While what happened was in fact unfortunate, this is just a brief post-election analysis. We should still take heart that we are not necessarily in the minority in terms of the electorate being divided between workers and moochers, or free riders, because if we look at the numbers, there were more registered Republicans than at any point previously in history, and had they all voted and voted for Mitt Romney, it would have more than likely been enough to sway the election, because it was approximately 3 million votes that simply did not show up. I'm not going to go into why they didn't. More than likely it was because they were disgruntled with the choice of Mitt Romney as the candidate, or had some other dissatisfaction with the party. And while this is understandable, I would have figured, and in fact I did figure, that voting out this sham of a president would have been more important than what quibbles you had with the Republican nominee. Granted, he was not perfect, but at that point I had sort of figured, well, more or less anybody would have been better than what we have now. However, to get back to my main point, there were 3 million votes that simply did not show up for us that we had in fact counted on. And those 3 million votes more than likely were in the camp of those people who still value hard work and believe in personal property rights and self-reliance, rugged individualism, etc. So while this will be in fact a major setback for the country, both politically and economically, I urge you to take heart, because we at least were able to hold the House, and that will in some respects hinder any unbridled runaway government initiatives on Barack Obama's part. Still, it's not ideal, and we have a lot of work to do. But with prayer and our genuine love of country, hopefully we will be able to make things right, not only in the next presidential election in 2016, but also hopefully in the midterm elections in 2014, where we can hopefully have a repeat of the 2010 turnout and cripple the liberal agenda. However, I reiterate, I urge everyone to take heart, because as those who are more constitutionally acute know, nullification is still an option, as is secession, should it become necessary. God forbid it should ever come to full-blown rebellion, but if it were to come to that, well, I hope I'm better shooting a gun than I am shooting off my mouth. But enough about the more depressing side of things. It is what it is, and on the plus side, at the very least, the election's over, and we can all just go drown our sorrows in a bottle of Maker's Mark. But in commemoration of our soon-to-be nearly entirely crippled and severely damaged economy, let's cover the Commerce Clause, shall we? We started off last time beginning our delving into the understanding of the Commerce Clause after wrapping up the Taxing Clause, or the Common Defense and General Welfare Clause. However, I think, again, brief recap we can go into would help, and then we can just go forward from there. Now, again, in its full text, the clause in question says that Congress shall have the power to, quote, regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, end quote. Now, first, we should note that at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, the term commerce was not really fully defined yet as a legal term or term of art, and little mention of it is made in Blexton. So the best thing we can really do is try to define commerce and what it means to regulate it, and hopefully by studying its context and the writings of those who crafted the terminology itself, we can better understand what they meant it to do and mean. First, we should try to build up from what is the more common notion of the word. Obviously, one of the first things that comes to mind when we think of the word commerce is probably something close to all business activity aimed at gaining a profit, or something very close to just trade. The latter may not, in fact, be too far from what the founders meant when they used the word commerce. The term is used many times over in the Federalist Papers and in Madison's notes on the Federal Convention. And in no instance does commerce really seem to mean anything more than just trade. I highly recommend Madison's notes on the Federal Convention as a nearly invaluable source as for understanding the Constitution and what the founders were thinking when they crafted it. Now, just to take one example, we have Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Number 11, in which he said, quote, "An unrestrained intercourse between the states themselves will advance the trade of each by an interchange of their respective production, not only for the supply of reciprocal wants at home, but for exportation to foreign markets. The veins of commerce in every part will be replenished, and will acquire additional motion and vigor from a free circulation of the commodities of every part. Commercial enterprise will have much greater scope from the diversity in the productions of different states," end quote. Now, clearly, one can see that the nature of the word commerce, even as held by the loose constructionist Alexander Hamilton, doesn't really particularly lend itself to a more broad interpretation. Rather, it's more likely to be construed in a far narrower sense. The same can be said of Hamilton's use of the term in Federalist Number 21, where he claims that, quote, "The wealth of nations depends upon an infinite variety of causes: situation, soil, climate, the nature of the productions, the nature of the government, the genius of its citizens, the degree of information they possess, the state of commerce, of arts, of industry. These circumstances, and many much too complex, minute, or adventitious to admit of a particular specification, occasion differences hardly conceivable in the relative opulence and riches of different countries," end quote. Now, again, not only is it implied that the word commerce is intended to have a narrow definition, but also is explicitly differentiated from, quote, "the nature of productions," end quote. The broader definition is at least partially eclipsed as a possible interpretation at this point. Now, just for further reference, Hamilton also uses the word commerce in Federalists Number 12, 17, and 35, should you want to look that up for yourself. Now, James Madison's notes on the convention are also relatively helpful in gleaning information on this topic. One particularly helpful excerpt is in his account of the events of Saturday, August 18th, 1787. Madison submitted several ideas of what powers might be added to those granted to the Congress, and among them he included the power, quote, "to establish public institutions, rewards, and immunities for the promotion of agriculture, commerce, trades, and manufactures," end quote. Now, such phraseology, while the measure was ultimately defeated, this phraseology strongly suggests that the attendees of the convention understood commerce to mean no more than really trade or exchange. Such phraseology also distinguishes commerce from the productive processes that generate the goods to be exchanged. By this point, almost all doubt that commerce should be understood to have a more constricted meaning is removed. And even so, should anyone have any remaining doubts in spite of this evidence, it's strongly recommended that you study the ratification debates of the several states. The states whose debates should yield the most fruit are those of Massachusetts, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and especially Virginia. God bless you, Old Dominion. Even though you went blue this year, I'm very disappointed in you. However, this does not necessarily solidify exactly what commerce means. Therefore, one should see if the term commerce is used anywhere else in the Constitution if we hope to glean any more useful information. And it is indeed used elsewhere, but only once, in Article 1, Section 9, where it says in part that, quote, "No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another," end quote. Now, the interesting thing about the use of the word commerce here is that it implies more than just trade alone. Now, Richard A. Epstein dissected the text while also highlighting the historical and etymological background behind it. And this is going to be a relatively long block quote, but I think it does shine a lot of light onto this topic. Now, he says, quote, "The first place to look to find the meaning of the Commerce Clause is the text of the clause itself. Here one notices the word commerce governs three separate acts of relations, those with foreign nations, among the states, and with the Indian tribes. One should assume that the word commerce applies with equal force to all three cases and bears the same meaning with respect to each of its objects. Similarly, one does not want a meaning of the term commerce which renders any one of these three heads of the commerce power redundant or unnecessary. The modern view, which says that commerce among the several states includes all manufacture and other productive activity within each and every state, because of the effect that such manufacture has upon commerce, violates this constraint. Taking the alternative position that commerce means trade, or as Chief Justice Marshall said, here he's referencing the 1824 Supreme Court case of Gibbons versus Ogden, intercourse covered both shipping and navigation, and the contracts regulating buying and selling. Using that two-part definition, it becomes clear that trade with foreign nations is not trade among the several states or with the Indian tribes. Each part of the clause attributes the same meaning to the Commerce Clause, and attributes the same meaning to the term commerce, and each of the objects of the clause, foreign nations, the states, and Indian tribes, becomes an indispensable part of the constitutional structure. It is worth noting that this view of commerce as trade is consistent with the other prominent mention of the word commerce in the Constitution. Article 1 also states that no preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another. The term commerce is used in opposition to the term revenue and seems clearly to refer to shipping and incidental activities. This much seems evident from the use of the term port." End quote. That's taken from his book, The Proper Scope of the Commerce Clause, which I found in a collection of works. The collection was called Liberty, Property, and Government, Constitutional Interpretation Before the New Deal. But, again, I would urge people to go and check it out for themselves if they are so inclined. As Epstein, or Epstein, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, I'm going to say Epstein. As Epstein so aptly points out, commerce does mean trade, but also means something a bit more. Therefore, given the additional mention of commerce in Article 1, Section 9, it almost certainly can be interpreted in neither its narrowest nor its broadest sense. Rather, an appropriate interpretation is between these two extremes. The something more contained within the term commerce is likely shipping, navigation, and other means of transporting the goods to be traded, as well as the agreements made which govern such trade. Such an assertion is not much of a logical stretch. There are very few, if any, commercial activities which do not in some way involve the navigation or shipping of goods, and thus, as used in the Constitution, commerce means, quote, "the trade or exchange of goods as well as the means incidental to their transportation and those contractual agreements which govern the trade. Close quote. Now, that quote there was my own, again, conjecturing, sort of summing up what we've learned. Now, to be sure, we have to understand that such trade or exchange is necessarily mutually voluntary. Forced trade is essentially theft or holding you up at gunpoint. That is a minor clarification and probably an unnecessary one, but I felt I should do it anyway. Now, with commerce defined, we can now question what it means to regulate it. Now, first, it is important to note the overall purpose of explicitly giving this power to Congress. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress lacked such a power. In such absence, the states all saw to their own respective commercial regulation. Madison recounted the situation in his Federalist number 42, where he says, quote, "The defect of power in the existing Confederacy to regulate the commerce between the several members is in the number of those which have been clearly pointed out by experience. A very material object of this power was the relief of the states which import and export through other states from the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Were these at liberty to regulate the trade between state and state, it must be foreseen that ways would be found out to load the articles of import and export during the passage through their jurisdiction with duties which would fall on the makers of the latter and the consumers of the former. We may be assured by past experience that such a practice would be introduced by future contrivances, and both by that and a common knowledge of human affairs, that it would nourish unceasing animosities and not improbably terminate in serious interruptions of the public tranquility." Now, close quote. Now, it's obvious that the key aim of the Commerce Clause is uniformity in trade. We're all on the same page. We're all able to sort of have the assumption that certain things are going to be certain ways and that we can expect trade to flow uninterrupted and in a way that will get the goods to market without any surprises or unforeseen misfortunes. Such a deduction is greatly bolstered in light of the economic conditions of the Union immediately following the American War for Independence. The break with England introduced great economic uncertainty and made, according to Robert Bork and Daniel E. Troy, this is in the Harvard Junior Law and Public Policy Review, is called. There was an article called "Locating the Boundaries: The Scope of Congress's Power to Regulate Commerce." They said, quote, the break with England introduced great economic uncertainty and made, quote, "retaliatory trade barriers begin to spread among the states. Many states passed laws interfering directly with commerce, including port fees, taxes, and exclusionary trade laws," end quote. Now, the founders knew that such a situation was politically unstable, and commercial uniformity, both foreign and domestic, would be necessary to ensure a union of any lasting kind. Before proceeding further, it would be helpful to consult a more contemporaneous dictionary to get a hint as to what the verb "to regulate" meant in the days of the convention. One of the most prominent dictionaries of the day was Samuel Johnson's 2-volume work, whose abbreviated title was simply "A Dictionary of the English Language." In it, Johnson defined "to regulate" as follows: quote, 1, to adjust by rule or method, or 2, to direct, end quote. Now, using this trade definition, author Randy E. Barnett elaborated in the original meaning of the Commerce Clause, which is in the University of Chicago Law Review. Quote, "In other words, the term 'to regulate' means to make regular. The power to regulate is, in essence, the power to say, if you want to do something, here is how you must do it. For example, the making of contracts and wills are regulated by the law of contracts and estates. To make an enforceable agreement for the sale of goods over $500 requires that the agreement be in writing. To make a will requires a specified number of witnesses to one signature. These requirements regulate, or make regular, the making of contracts and wills by subjecting them to a rule or method," end quote. Now, if one combines the knowledge of the founders' reasons for including commercial regulation among the powers of Congress with the above statement concerning the more technical definition of "to regulate," they synthesize rather nicely. And when the Constitution says that Congress has the authority to regulate commerce, It means Congress may set up the rules by which such commerce is to be conducted or governed. On a more technical note, one might ask whether the power to regulate commerce includes a power to prohibit it in some form or fashion. Here, a rather fine yet important distinction has to be drawn. Now, first, again, if we're referring to Samuel Johnson's dictionary, the verb to prohibit means, quote, 1, to forbid, to interdict by authority, or 2, to debar, to hinder, end quote. Clearly, to regulate and to prohibit cannot be the same thing. The former is to adjust by rule or statute how something is done, whereas the latter, as Barnett commented, says that one may not do a particular activity at all. Here's another excerpt from Robert Bork and Daniel Troy's work. They viewed such a statement as a bit of an oversimplification. They contended that, quote, Johnson's definition of regulate does not necessarily exclude prohibition. If, for example, the government were to regulate the flow of mail from one state to another, that regulation might include a prohibition on one state holding the mail for excessive fees. Regulation of a larger activity, in other words, may logically include the prohibition of lesser included activities. It does not, therefore, seem logically necessary, given Johnson's definition of to regulate and to prohibit, that the power to regulate interstate commerce could not also include the power to prohibit certain manners, modes, or impediments to commerce. Moreover, it was understood that future Congresses might have an interest in limiting or prohibiting foreign commerce in order to advance foreign policy or budding American industry. The power granted to Congress to regulate foreign commerce thus unquestionably included the power to prohibit some commerce through the imposition of tariffs or preferential trade policies. Because the purposes behind the foreign and interstate segments of the clause were so different, some have argued that the word regulate entailed a subtly different meaning with respect to each sphere. That may be, but it is unlikely that the same word, to regulate, includes the power to prohibit when modifying foreign commerce, but not when modifying commerce among the several states. That said, Congress's power to prohibit commerce among the states may be limited by the purpose of the clause, so that Congress is limited to eliminating modes of trade that impede interstate commerce, end quote. Now, both positions have merit. In fact, we could arguably conceive that both are right, although from different perspectives. From an absolute standpoint, Barnett's position seems the more feasible, given it seems logically given the constitutional terminology used that Congress cannot, in fact, bar trade. Rather, Congress can only regulate it. That is, it cannot say that trade may not be done, but may only prescribe how it is to be done. Bork and Troy seem to be correct as well, for they, in fact, did not really disagree, in my opinion, with Barnett. In a sense, they sort of made Barnett's same argument, but in a way sort of used an intellectual double negative, I suppose. I hope that's not getting too lofty. They argued that the power to regulate commerce could encompass the power to prohibit certain manners, modes, or impediments to commerce. The first two, manners or modes, being different means to performing commercial activities, merely affirm the position that Congress may force trade to be conducted in a certain way. However, to say that something must be done in a certain way also implies that it cannot be done in another. The third item that Bork and Troy mentioned, impediments to commerce, which they believe that Congress may prohibit, is itself a kind of prohibition. They're prohibiting them prohibiting those sorts of those impediments. Like, those impediments were, in fact, impediments to commerce were prohibitions, and to prohibit that from being done is them prohibiting the states making a prohibition. So, in fact, you'll notice that's almost, in effect, just regulating commerce from a normal standpoint. Now, that is, Congress indirectly has the power to prohibit, as Bork and Troy say, modes of trade that impede interstate commerce. However, as said before, since the power to regulate commerce extends identically to its three objects, this implies that Congress also has the power to prohibit modes of trade that impede commerce with foreign nations and Indian tribes as well. Regardless, the power to prohibit certain means of doing trade seems to be merely a logical extension of the power to regulate trade itself. Now, the final major issue concerning the Commerce Clause is what is meant by commerce among the several states. This is not overly troublesome and can be resolved with a few excerpts from the Federalist Papers. Now, aside from the fact that the usage of the term itself in the Constitution should make the definition plain, Hamilton's reference to it in Federalist number 23 renders its meaning rather unambiguous. He says, quote, "The principal purposes to be answered by union are these: the common defense of its members, the preservation of the public peace as well against internal convulsions as external attacks, the regulation of commerce with other nations and between the states, the superintendence of our intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries." End quote. Now also, one of the principal intentions of the founders was that the states should be able to do all things not forbidden to them by the Constitution, that the federal government could only do those things permitted. Madison himself affirmed that in Federalist number 45. I won't quote that to you because it's easy enough you can find that and look at it yourself, but it's plain by his text that we can determine that anything that is solely the concern of a single state is to remain fully under the control of that state. That would be intra-state commerce, not inter-state commerce. So it's clear that the Commerce Clause the part concerning commerce among the several states means commercial activity that concerns more than one state or crosses state boundaries. Therefore, intra-state commerce remains completely under the state's respective jurisdictions. Now, this point is not completely necessary to garner full understanding of the clause. I believe that I should just give everybody give them all the details they need to understand it, just in case. So, finally, when we compile all the information uncovered so far, we can successfully render the Commerce Clause to mean this: Congress has the power to establish the rules by which trade, and the incidental activities thereof, must be conducted, be it trade with foreign countries, between the states, or with the Indian tribes. So, I think that will do for now. We can pick up next time with the term of art and all the associated powers therefrom, which confounds us modern folk, the power to, quote, coin money. We'll pick that up next time. As for right now, I would ask that everybody pray for the continued prosperity and longevity of the United States of America, as well as all of her people, regardless of how much of a mistake we've made in giving Barack Hussein Obama II another term. I would hope that God will forgive us, or at least those of us who are smart enough not to fall for that sort of the sort of empty promises that are made by liberalism and its followers. However, in the meantime, I just hope that we can all stay strong and continue to build this country and save it as originally founded, no matter how many generations it takes. Let it begin with us, I suppose. So in the meantime, I would only say good night, God bless, and may God, despite our failures, continue to bless the United States of America. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.